Well, good morning, friends. It's great to see all of you. And for those of you who might be visiting us this morning, my name is Father Chris Stanish. I'm the Vicar General for the diocese. And along with Father Jim Wozniak, the pastor here, we just want to offer you a very warm welcome and let you know what a great joy it is to be able to celebrate this Mass with you. So as I was praying with the readings throughout this week, I kept thinking about what is at the very heart of these readings, and that is what it means to forgive. Right? I think none of us are strangers to having to forgive people in our lives, knowing that at some point somebody's going to say something or do something to us. Oftentimes we'll carry that with us, and it's important for us to know how to forgive, because a lot of things that we hear out in our culture about forgiveness is actually very far off of the mark of what we believe as Christians. And so I think it's important for us to really take a look what it means to forgive, what it is to actually let go of either what we expect other people to do, whether that's an apology or some of their action, or perhaps even a punishment that we think this person deserves. And so I really want to lean into this so that we can have a proper understanding of what it means to forgive according to Christ's words. So if we look at our readings today, especially our first reading, right? We have this character of David, and if we remember David's backstory, he started off as a lowly shepherd boy, and he's called up from the ranks, and he battles Goliath and wins, and ultimately he becomes very, very successful working for King Saul. But that's the problem, right? He's so successful that they're actually singing songs about him, and what does that do to King Saul? It makes him jealous. And so he actually does everything he can to try to put David on the front line, to get him killed. He even sends people after him to have him murdered. And so here we enter into today's story, and here is David, who has an opportunity to take revenge, right? He can retaliate because here's King Saul sleeping away, and he's ultimately caught. But David chooses a different path. Right? Instead of revenge, instead of retaliation, he chooses to honor his enemy. And in many ways, this prepares us for what Jesus says in the gospel today, because today's gospel is a continuation of Luke's version of the Beatitudes, right? So we heard the Beatitudes, blessed are they, right? And then Luke continues to talk about what it is to love our enemies, right? To do good to those who do bad to us. And ultimately, it ends with this conclusion that we have to forgive so that we ourselves may be forgiven. Now, when we think about this, too often our lives are blocked and our relationships are impeded because we're holding on to past hurts, right? And this could be, our past failures, it could be our past sinfulness, it could be the way people have said things to us or done things to us. But at the end of the day, it leaves a wound. And that wound, we can have two things that we could do. One, we could allow it to heal and we can move and live in freedom. Or two, we can hold on to it and we can allow it to harden our hearts and prevent us then from living in freedom. Right? And I think a lot of times when we think about forgiveness, there's probably three really misnomers that we carry with us that is why we're afraid to forgive. The first is because sometimes we think that to forgive means to forget. Sometimes it's because we think that to forgive somebody means to excuse their bad behavior. And I think the third one is that a lot of times we're afraid to forgive because we feel that if we forgive, then somehow it makes it okay. But those three things have nothing to do with our Christian understanding of forgiveness. Why? Because they're stupid. That's why. Right? Jesus didn't say forgive and forget. He didn't say, if you forgive, then, it excuses people's bad behavior. Right? He didn't say those things. And so it helps us to understand, what did he say? What does he mean by forgiveness? Well, it's actually very simple. Forgiveness, according to Christianity, is a matter of acknowledging the hurt and then letting go of whatever expectation we have about it. Whether that's what we think somebody owes us, or whether we think some punishment that they deserve, right? It's a matter of letting go of those things. So what I'd like for us to do this morning is really just to think about how it is that we can forgive. So whether we're holding on to unforgiveness or not, the way that you can know, right? Because you might be sitting there thinking like, oh, well, I don't have anybody to forgive. The way you can know whether you have somebody to forgive is to think about a hurt or to think about a person where something happened, and does it still draw emotion in you, right? Because think about it. Our thoughts lead to emotions. Our emotions lead to behaviors. And so it's important for us to understand how that works so that we can see what's going on inside of our heart and we can deal with it. So the first thing is uncovering the wound, right? If you get hurt and you go to the doctor, right, the first thing that they're going to say is, let me see the wound, right? Where did you get hurt? And it's the same thing spiritually, right? So what we do is we go into our prayer, we place ourselves in the presence of God, and we tell him about the wound. What hurt you? Tell him about the person, the circumstances, the emotions that you felt, right? Lean into it in such a way that you're very, very specific about what that situation was, right? But also, how did you respond to them? Were you sad? Were you angry? Were you bitter? Were you resentful? Thinking about that. How intensely did you feel it? And then thinking about, how did it affect your daily life? Have you been lacking in patience? Have you been outbursting with other people? Have you found yourself with a shorter fuse, right? How is it affecting your daily life? But then here's the kicker. You should also tell Jesus about what you think about that other person, right? Because we all carry those and we say them inside of our minds saying like, oh, that person, I hope that they did this or they shouldn't, right? And we allow those thoughts to generate. What's fascinating is that the average human being has anywhere from 40 to 60,000 thoughts a day. 95% of those are repeated. 80% of them are negative. 75% are both repeated and negative, right? And that's what fills our mind, is what fills our heart, right? It hardens our heart. It prevents us from making a gift of ourselves to others. So that's the first step, is firstly to uncover the wound. The second step is to choose a different way, right? Just like David in that reading. He chose a different path. We can do that too, because the reality is that very likely the one who hurt you cannot give back what they took from you, right? And if you're gonna wait and wait and wait to get that back, or for them to get punished the way you think they should be punished, you're actually poisoning yourself, right? Because what if it never happens? Are you gonna live in misery the rest of your life because it doesn't happen? Or are you gonna choose a different path and live in freedom because your happiness does not depend on the other person? Happiness is something that we choose, right? And so choosing a different path is about making sure that we don't get trapped in those negative emotions. And it's important for us to acknowledge before the Lord that we've tried, right? That we try to do it on our own, but that we can't, right? God is that higher power in our life, and he's the one who ultimately will be able to judge that person. That's not up to you, and it's not up to me. Right? That's the reality. But we have to ask ourselves in that moment, am I willing to let go of that debt or that punishment that I'm expecting from that person? And if so, then in that moment, ask the Lord to help you forgive. The third step is to work on the forgiveness, right? As I mentioned, it's very hard for us to do this on our own. Sometimes it's very easy, but the majority of time, it's hard for us to forgive those hurts. And so in your prayer, what you really want to do is imagine that you're taking that person to Jesus, right? Bring that person to the foot of the cross and ask the Lord to forgive that person, right? And that might be hard because you're like, well, I don't want that person to be forgiven. And that's when you really need to start thinking about the other person's story, right? To see them as another human being. They probably have past hurts as well. How did they grow up? What were the circumstances of what happened? Right? Was something going on in their life that caused them to do this, right? And as we can begin to see them as Jesus sees them, that'll make it easier for us then to ask the Lord to forgive, right? And that's the beautiful thing about it, right? Having this prayer from the cross where Jesus himself said, Father, forgive them for they do not know what they do, right? If Jesus can forgive them, then it helps us then to experience that freedom, to be able to forgive them in a deeper way. The last part is this, and that is embracing freedom, right? That when we're able to surrender whatever that expectation is that we have, all of a sudden that hardness goes away because it gives us the ability then to actually give ourselves freely to other people as a gift, right? We can pour ourselves out again. We can go and we can smile and we can be joyful and, live in that peace that God desires for us to have, right? And when we forgive, you'll notice this dramatic shift, right? Between kind of this comparison of the darkness of the wound versus the light that we experience in forgiveness. Or another way to say that would be basically kind of looking at what it is to move from demanding certain expectations to forgiving and experiencing freedom, right? It's a dramatic shift. And part of that is offering our pain or our suffering back to the Lord. I mean, I can tell you that oftentimes it's our pain or our suffering that molds us and forms us and helps us to be the person that we are today. I mean, even in my own life, I know that in many ways it's some of my past wounds that have helped me to deal with the things that I go through right now in my job as Vicar General, that I never would have thought, I never would have imagined. But it's only in looking back that you see how the Lord has been working, right? The Lord doesn't desire those hurts. The Lord doesn't desire that suffering for us, but he permits it so that way our hearts can be prepared for whatever's next. And so my friends, uncover the wound, choose a different path, work on forgiveness, and embrace freedom. My friends, this is what Jesus' mission was all about, right? It was the very first thing he said when he said, repent and believe in the gospel, and the very last thing he said on the cross when he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, right? That's the heart of Jesus' ministry. So what I want to encourage you this week, especially as we prepare for Lent, starts a week from Wednesday, is to start thinking about in your life, are you holding on to any bitterness, any resentment, any unforgiveness? And allow yourself to uncover that wound and to live and embrace freedom.